Hey nerdy knitters, in this video we're going to look at two methods for stretchy shawl bind-offs. A basic bind-off is good for lots of different things, but sometimes you need a little bit of stretch, sometimes you need a lot of stretch, and usually with a shawl, especially a lace shawl, you want a bind-off edge that will really stretch so you can block and pin that shawl out and really define those lace edges. We'll look at two methods today, the yarn over bind-off and the lace bind-off, which is also called the elastic bind off, the Estonian bind off, the Russian bind off. It has a lot of different names, but there's one way to work it and a few different tweaks we can make to it to use it for other things as well. But before we jump right into that, I just want to say, hey, I'm Tanya here at Nerdy Knitting. I'm a certified knitting instructor and a knitwear designer, and my goal is to help you become a confident, adventurous knitter. If you want timestamp links to these methods, or if you're looking for the written instructions, check down in the video description box for those. So let's look at those shawl bind-offs. I have a little section of feather and fan here, a pretty common stitch pattern, and I used a regular basic bind off right there. And you can see I did try to bind off loosely, so it's not too bad. It's got the curved edge that it should have, but it's not going to go very far. It's not going to stretch. Well, it'll stretch that way because of those yarn overs, but it's not going to stretch out as far as I would like it to. In this section, let's try the yarn over bind off and see how that compares. You start by knitting your first two stitches. You bind off that first stitch and you have one stitch on here. This is where you just work a yarn over and you pull that stitch over the yarn over. Then you knit another stitch, bind it off, do another yarn over, pull that stitch over the yarn over. And you just continue doing this. You have two stitches, bind one off, yarn over, bind off. That's it. And that adds, those extra yarn overs in there add a lot of slack to your bind off edge. And you would continue doing this, binding off, yarn over, pull it over. One good thing with this bind off is you can change the rate of the yarn overs. You could put a yarn over after every third stitch, after every fourth bind off stitch. That will change how stretchy it is. Of course you'd want to swatch it out, but you could use it for a sock where you want a lot of stretch, or a neckline where you just want a little stretch. You put fewer yarn overs in. This is a good way to add a little bit of extra elasticity to your bind off, still using the basic bind off and tossing in extra yarn overs wherever you think you want a little extra stretch. For this lace section though, I'm going to work yarn overs after every set of bind off stitches. So let me finish that and then we'll see how it looks. There, I finished this next section and you can see just by looking at it. This one lays pretty flat and it does stretch a little, maybe not as much as you'd want for a shawl. This one ruffles right up, so there's a lot of stretch in that. Now of course you might not want so much stretch in something like a neckline. That's where that tip for using a yarn over after every 3 or 4 bind off stitches can help. But you can see this is going to stretch a lot compared to that first one. And if you look closely at it, you can't really see the yarn overs in this because we've got all of this design going on. But in a less heavy stitch pattern, you would probably see the little yarn overs underneath there. But it's right on the bind off edge, and that's how you get that extra stretch, is all those extra yarn overs. But that's not the only stretchy bind off method. There's also the lace bind off, which is also called the elastic bind off, and I've also heard it referred to as the Estonian bind off and the Russian bind off. It has lots of different names, but it's worked the same way. Okay, in this bind off, you knit your first 2 stitches. If you're on the edge of a shawl and you've been working like a slip stitch edge, you could easily slip the first stitch too as well. When you have your 2, you slide them back, put your left needle into the front of the stitches, and from this position just wrap the yarn and knit them. You're knitting them through the back legs of the stitches. Knit another stitch, transfer them over, knit them together through the back legs of the stitch. That's all there is to it. This one is fairly simple. Knit another stitch, slide them over, knit them through the back legs. Okay, I've finished this one right here. So there's a comparison of all 3. Our basic bind off, which you can see is a lot flatter than this one. And of course, so this one here, the yarn over one, produces the one with the most stretch with all of those yarn overs in there. You can see that's going to stretch quite a lot. But this one's a good alternative too, perhaps for a sock or for a shawl that doesn't need quite as much stretch. Now it's easy to change this lace bind off and work it in a purl pattern, or if you wanted to combine knits and purls, say in a rib on a cuff of a sock or something like that, it's easy to adjust, and I'll show you exactly how to do that. Before that though, if you have a favorite shawl bind off that you love to use that we haven't talked about here, be sure to leave a comment and tell us about it. Be sure to give this video a thumbs up if you liked it. And if you're looking for a more decorative bind off, check out this video I have for a picot bind off. Now in this last section, I'm going to work the purl version of this bind off, and then I'll show you how you can use it for a rib pattern. So you still have our 2 stitches. I purled this stitch. So what we're going to do is slide them over here and purl them together. We have 1 stitch. I will purl this stitch, slide them back to your needle, but this time keep your right needle to the front so you're ready just to purl them together. Purl the next stitch, slide them back to your left needle, purl them together. So I'll finish this and we'll take a look at it, and then how we can change this to do an alternating knit and purl pattern. There, that's the purl version. It's hard to see here. I'll bring it closer, but the stretch is the same, but in this version, that bind off sort of curls to the front of the work. With the purl version, it moves it to the back. So if you want your bind off to not be as noticeable, but you still want all the stretch, the purl version might be a good idea. Or if you're working the wrong side row and you want to work it in purl, you could do that. You can see it right there, the bind off sort of moves to the back. So there's a bunch of different ways to work it. Now how would we change this to use it for something like a rib? Basically, you're going to knit the knits and purl the purls. So you would start, say you were working here, you'd knit your stitch, and knit 2 together through the back loop. The next stitch to be bound off is a purl stitch. Purl the stitch, purl those 2 together. Purl the stitch, purl together, then it's a knit again. So knit that stitch and then knit them together through the back legs. So you can use this pattern to alternate any knit and purl combination. All you have to remember is to knit the knits, purl the purls, and whatever stitch you've just completed, that's what you use when you purl them or knit them together. If you just completed a purl stitch, you purl the 2 stitches on your right needle together. If you just knit the stitch, then you would knit the 2 stitches through the back legs. So you could do any combination of knits and purls as long as you remember that rule. So there you have 2 stretchy bind off methods for your shawl patterns. One very stretchy with those yarn overs if you need a stretchy bind off for a lace shawl. If you just need a moderate amount of stretch, the lace or elastic bind off is a good choice, and it's a good alternative for things like ribs and cuffs. Be sure to give this video a thumbs up, and if you like to get nerdy with your knitting, be sure to subscribe.